Hello, and welcome to the People Grow Places podcast, where we explore the virtuous circle of people, growth, and place. Brought to you by Grow Places and hosted by our founder, Tom Larson.
Right, hi Andrew, how are you doing?
I'm good, thanks.
You good?
Yeah, very good.
You say you're a bit tired today from the jet lag?
A little bit jet lagged. Yeah, a little bit jet lagged. I just came back from the West Coast, and it's always, it takes you by surprise. You think you're fine, you think you mastered it, and then a couple of days in, it's just like, oh my God.
Just hits you.
Yeah.
The podcast is probably not exactly what you want to be doing, but it'll be good.
It'll
be good.
Yeah.
So we're in your lovely new offices. We're surrounded by, your timber, your designs. It must feel nice to kind of have that sort of space.
Yeah, I love it.
That sort of exemplifies what you're about, really.
Yeah. No, it's kind of, I started in practice with Anthony pretty much straight from college, and every year it's kind of like, the projects have grown, the office has grown a little bit. We've moved office. I think this is like our 5th office. And I love it here. Came back in on Monday morning and it's just like, it's such a nice place to be. I think it has a good atmosphere.
Yeah, it does. It does. Your last place did as well, but this one does particularly. I think it's really nice, and it's nice that we're surrounded by big lumps of timber and other things, and that kind of expresses your passions really. And I think that's something that as an outsider has always kind of shone through. Obviously, you've set your stall out quite early around a kind of manifesto and a mission statement really, and kind of talk to me about where that kind of comes from for you in terms of what drives you and personally, and then what drives you on the business side.
No, sure. I mean, it wasn't there wasn't some massive epiphany. It didn't happen like overnight, and I certainly when I was at college, sustainability or the notion of a sustainable architecture wasn't something that drove me in architecture. But as the years of practice have gone on, and the way that we think about architecture as a practice and the way that we think about our work, the importance of understanding the implications of that work on the planet have become, really core to what we do as a practice. So it's like, so it's designing out carbon, it's like low carbon design. How can we build things? How can we build a future with using less energy and with less emissions, using materials that we can grow more of and not dig out the ground or make from oil? So, these things become increasingly important. I think that if architecture doesn't have social value, then if it doesn't represent the really vital issues of its day, then where's its relevance? Where's its license? Yeah,
no, absolutely. And I think, you mentioned it there for the profession of architecture, but for you personally, do you kind of know why is this such a strong burning thing for you personally?
I think that, well, for one thing, I've probably learned a bit too much about it. Not to, I've looked inside the box.
Yeah.
I've had the fear, So I guess there's that. And once you really start thinking about climate change and reading about the climate crisis, then I think, then if I worked in a way which I didn't feel was at least in some part a solution to the problem that we have, then I wouldn't really be able to live with myself. I think you have to think that you're leaving the world a better place. And not just because you put a new shiny object in it, but because actually you've moved the conversation on. You've been hopefully part of the solution. Mm-hmm. And when I was at college, I was just talking to somebody about this morning actually, and I thought, I'm going to tell Tom this. But this morning, I was thinking that somebody was asking me if I did, if I was interested in sustainability when I was at architecture school. And honestly, I really wasn't. Sustainability was something that you did when you weren't very good at design, and that's terrible. And also, it was really presented as a kind of hair shirt kind of compromise, a very kind of Protestant sort of, well, it can't be quite as nice if it's good for you, sort of muesli type kind of, culture to that way of thinking. And I think that turned everybody off. And I think it turns architects off, especially because architects, to that Rem Koolhaas thing about the optimist gene, architects are optimists in general. You have to be an optimist. And you can't be an optimist and propose a pessimistic architecture. Kind of hair shirt, straw bale, mushroom type architecture. It's not going to solve the urban housing crisis. It's not going to move us forward. So it's become increasingly an important part of my practice, of our practice.
Mm-hmm.
So and now it really, I think it influences every decision that's made in the practice.
Mm. Yeah, and the role of the architect is, it's more, as you say, there's a lot about conversation and a lot about influence in different ways other than just through the built form, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think the architect is the thought leader of the construction industry. I don't think that reducing carbon in construction is purely the job of the architect. I think that is the responsibility of us all. From the insurance broker to the estate agent, to the developer, to the engineer, to the architect, all of us need to be working on that together. But I do think that part of the training of an architect, part of the role of an architect in society is about that kind of thought leadership around construction and building architecture.
Yeah. And I took this. I got given this post-it when I came into your office today, which is the Wi-Fi code. I don't know if you know what this is. Do you?
Yes.
So I hope no one's going to crack your Wi-Fi, but it's #construction revolution.
Well, it was until today.
I won't tell you where the capital letters are and the symbols are, but that kind of sums it up. I thought I'd just mention that because I thought that was pretty apt.
No, we I love things like that. No, it's and that's what it is. That's what we need to do. Yeah. It's, for many years we talked about timber as, don't worry, it's very easy, take out the concrete and steel and you put in timber or other low carbon solutions and the process is the same, etc. But it's not. Because it changes the process of design and it changes the process of construction. So, it's a new way of looking at things. And so we're learning all the time how to kind of understand the processes that suit a new type of building, suit a new kind of type of architecture.
Yeah. The other aspect of this for me, which I think is even more pertinent when you're designing projects, is that our projects in the built environment take often 5, maybe 10 years to come to fruition from the first time you're briefed.
Yeah.
So it even brings that more into sharp focus, doesn't it? We talk about sort of 2030 and some of these other kind of sort of macro milestones that people are sort of aiming towards, but we're almost living those milestones now, aren't we, in terms of what we do?
Absolutely. And it kind of, I think that's, because everything takes so bloody long.
Yeah.
I think that it makes it even more important that it's concurrent. I mean, it's funny, we just finished a project where we demolished an existing building on the site and built our lovely new low carbon building. And the proposal for that was 5 or 6 years ago. And 5 or 6 years ago, actually the conversation about retaining the existing buildings, and if not retaining them, at least passporting all the materials and thinking about what would happen to the materials of the existing buildings, is so important now, which is great. The conversation has changed that much in 5 years, that 5 years ago, even a practice like ours, which thinks and talks about these things so much, wasn't really doing that. So it's, so actually almost, as soon as you finish the project, it's almost kind of out of date with the thinking of the practice. We're almost kind of like, people say, you take people around a finished project and they go, oh, what will you do differently next time? And you think, oh my God, the next time had already started happening, within a week or so of, finishing the working drawings. It's like, all the processes are constant and current.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's definitely true of all practice, but I do think there's obviously a very common thread that runs through your work and kind of your craft, isn't it? You've set your stall out around, a preference for timber structures and timber frame, and then you're trying to sort of master that craft, and you are one of, if not the leading kind of experts in that field now, nationally and internationally, which gives you a great platform. But as you say, that kind of comes from quite an early position. And one thing that I always remember, I think I've mentioned this to you before. I went on a walking tour with you a few years ago, and you were talking about the difference in your mind between being in practice and being in business.
Yeah.
And effectively, that purpose-led idea about practice.
Yeah.
And is there anything else you want to add about that?
No, I mean I do remember that. That was a few years ago.
It was quite a long time ago, actually.
And I remember,
it stuck with me.
Well, I've been listening to a podcast and read a book by Colin Mayer from Oxford University, from the Side Business School, about purpose-driven practice, or purpose-driven business rather, and the idea that actually a business with a sense of purpose had a far greater resilience to it and a far greater strength to it than a business which just went from, profit line to profit line. A business that had an ethos central to its existence seems still to me to be a kind of much more valid thing to dedicate your life to. We have a real sense of purpose here. We really want to change things. We want to build beautiful buildings in a low carbon way, and we want to constantly innovate, be constantly curious about how we can do better at that. How we can express the architecture in different ways, how we can drive the carbon down, how we can make the buildings more cost effective and faster and more attractive and more resilient, how we can build them so that they're easier to take down, easier to adapt, all those things. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's so much to talk about and think about and do that I can't imagine practicing without that sense of purpose.
Mm. And that obviously filters through to your team. It's very important, isn't it, for hiring, retaining staff, and those kind of things. And so, you mentioned you've got this clear mission around purpose and innovation. And so, where do you think the industry, the broader industry, kind of maybe helps and hinders you on that mission?
Yeah, I think it's there's both. You're absolutely right. You get encouragement, which is fantastic and incredibly rewarding when people are encouraging, and you do fall into competition with others who are just not addressing these issues, and that can be quite frustrating, but I think in general, actually, our experience has been incredibly positive. Until Murray Grove, which was 15 years ago now, until we built that building, we'd really been quite an isolated little practice, just beavering away, forgive the pun, in Shoreditch, in a corner, and then since then we've really started to talk about our work and to get confidence in talking about our work, and to actually think that, to start to begin to have the confidence that we had something valid to say,
mm-hmm. Yeah, and like any kind of disruption, any innovation, any kind of mission like that, there's a curve of adoption, isn't there? Where you have you're isolated, or maybe there's a few like-minded people quite early on, and then over time, the early majority and then almost the late majority kind of come on board with your thinking. And I feel like maybe mass consciousness, maybe in bigger markets like UK within the industry, not more broadly, but America and other places, does feel like maybe that kind of weight of majority is starting to move in the right direction.
Absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, not much in the UK. That's the frustration. Yeah. So we work a lot in the US and a lot in Europe, and less in the UK. And I think architectures, city legislators, clients, investors in Europe, in the US, really hungry, really passionate about, building buildings that reduce carbon, or in a way that reduces carbon from the regular way of building it. And I think that kind of enthusiasm is something that is really fantastic and really rewarding. But we're just not seeing it in the UK. Yeah. The ambition here is really low. The level of kind of turgid kind of conversation that we have with code officials, with building regs inspectors is really, really difficult. And the same with planners, with honestly often with developers too.
No, I think that's absolutely right, and
which is disappointing.
Yeah, and you get maybe oversimplification, but I feel like there's kind of two sort of ways or two types of attitude towards things like this in the world. There's one which is like you're saying, which is okay, what do we actually feel? What do we actually want to do? What do we feel is right? And then there's the other, which is a much more kind of like market-driven approach, which is okay, well, what's the market telling us, and then we kind of will respond to that. And you work obviously across different uses, but you look at the commercial workplace sector. There's a big push on ESG in its widest sense at the moment in the markets, which is obviously a great thing. But a lot of that is actually coming.
I mean, there's a big push here, but there's a massive push elsewhere.
But those pushes are kind of coming from, in a lot of respects, are coming from a demand side. Yeah. There's a demand, sort of occupier demand side, which is pushing it. And then that, in terms of, there's then a commercial justification as well as an environmental justification for doing some of these things, which is helping to push some of these agendas. When you look at, other uses, so, housing, something that I'm passionate about, I know you are too, and particularly kind of, mid-market and affordable housing for people. There are other drivers that at the moment are kind of ahead of sustainability in terms of people's thinking. So, affordability is the first one. So how do you think, maybe in the context of housing,
it's so short-sighted.
Yeah.
It's so short-sighted. I mean, affordability is something that we have leveled at us a lot. And it can be, if it's government-sponsored, government-paid for housing, how can you talk about the affordability of housing being, more important than the health of our planet, which is going to make everything inordinately more expensive? Yeah. I mean, it's so short-sighted. It feels to me so blindingly obvious that you can't actually separate out those notions of affordability, when we're not going to be able to afford to be able to live on our planet. I mean, it's crazy. We can't have that brick, or we can't do that in timber, we can't do that in a low carbon method, or we can't have low energy use buildings because we can't afford them. I mean, God, it's, we can't afford not to afford them.
Yeah. So I completely agree at a kind of government level, and that would mean, okay, well, what can the government, change taxes to kind of, sort of push some of this down from a top-down perspective. Because
these aren't massive changes, Tom, as well. The thing is that really gets me frustrated is what we do is trying to change an entire industry, an entire value system about where people think about success in architecture and in development. We're trying to change that on maybe a 5 or a 7% margin. Mm-hmm. We might call it the construction revolution, but it's not really. It's very it's quite polite. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? It's not massive. Yeah. These are very small changes that can have massive differences. Mm-hmm. Our industry is responsible for, currently about 40% we hear, but growing. 40% of carbon emissions in our industry. Yeah. And the amount of investment needed to massively change that is really quite small. Mm-hmm. If we look at a per building, per individual kind of measurement, it's really quite small. And I thought my whole career, I thought that legislators, government, the clever people are going to change this. And they haven't, especially in the UK and in the US. And actually the people, as you say, that are changing it are the investment funds, the ESG funds requiring that we build low carbon buildings. But in essence, I guess those funds come from simple choices made by teachers and postal workers and firefighters about their pensions. Yeah. Now that's kind of exciting. That you've got this kind of groundswell of very small movements outside of a democracy, making these small choices, important personal choices, which are driving a low carbon agenda now in development.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree. And if you talk about, sustainability with related to cities and places, one thing that I'm, keen to discuss a little bit more is the use of land and how is land used most responsibly? Because obviously, density as a kind of idea is something that certain places, are much denser than others, and how do you look at the use of timber related to density, and would you ever say there's a kind of a point where density overrides the use of a certain material? So let's say you can go to 15, 20, 30 stories. Yeah. Does that become more of a driver than the use of the material?
That's a really interesting question. I think that we need to look at what makes a healthy city. I don't believe that super tall buildings do make a healthy city, and I don't believe that super tall buildings can ever effectively make up a low carbon city either. So I think probably we shouldn't be building super tall buildings. We probably have enough, and if we can limit our cities to 10, even 15 stories, then we can increase the density massively in those cities. I think, and timber works, timber as a low carbon solution works with buildings of that height, which is great, right? So we have, I think, probably that kind of Goldilocks, sort of just right kind of height in Paris and Madrid and Berlin. That kind of 10 to 15 doesn't overshadow, doesn't create wind, good for old people and young people. You can still open a window and naturally ventilate. That's a good scale for a city, right? Then timber works. Engineered timber works for buildings of that scale. So that's perfect. That all works together. I'm really an adamant defender of the green belt. I really think that that's a terrible, lazy, cheap kind of way of thinking about urban development, is to build out more, semi-detached terraced houses into our green belt. I think that our green belt, our countryside is a much more precious asset than our suburbs.
Yeah, I think there's obviously there's kind of ideology and kind of reality in some of these things with regards to city planning, isn't there? Because if you take a new city somewhere, you would probably say, as you say, like getting density at mid-rise is appropriate and would be good, because that's kind of like Haussmann Paris type idea that you've kind of created these mansion blocks, and actually that's a way denser city than a city like London, which has got point blocks and then sort of two-story Victorian terraces. But it's hard, isn't it, now in London to then go, okay, well, unless you've got scale of a site that you can create density, the way that land ownership is fractured, the way that the city has just kind of evolved over time, it's very hard to have that kind of that scope, isn't there, to kind of en masse increase density. Yeah. So I don't know what the answer is somewhere like London.
What? Nobody's ever, from what I understand from all the GLA surveys of existing land within London, specifically within London, there's a lot to do. We have a lot left to do. Yeah. There's a lot of brownfield sites out there. There's a lot of underused land. There's lots of opportunities to build over railways.
A lot of public land, yeah.
Much more so, public land we can build. All these things without sacrificing our green belt, without sacrificing our parks, and without sacrificing the generosity of the city that we live in. So I think it's just lazy. I think it's lazy and greedy to think that we need to build on our green belt.
Yeah. No, I think the green belt as an idea is something that's, has really kind of held quite strong in some respects. But as you say, it's difficult to do things, I think, at scale in London, and without, I think, actually a lot of public sector land coming forward. So I think there's a real need for that to kind of come forward.
Absolutely, they need to be made. They need to be made to bring it forward. Yeah. There needs to be. I just came back from LA, right, which is just sprawling and never ending. Nobody walking anywhere. Everybody driving everywhere. The minute that you're in anywhere high and you look down on it, it's just this kind of mustard gas across the city. It's just horrific. You come back to London, soon as I kind of get out the train at Farringdon, it's kind of, people walking everywhere, and kind of like the air feels so much cleaner. It's just like, it's amazing. Yeah. It really is.
Yeah. And you always notice that, don't you? If you spend any time in London, you can actually walk everywhere really quickly. Yeah. You look at a tube map and you're like,
Yeah.
That's going to take me ages to get over there, whereas on foot, most things are kind of within half an hour. It's a great city for that.
No, it's really good. I mean, I'm in Shoreditch here. We can get to Holborn in about the same time by foot as you can by tube.
Yeah, exactly. So Andrew, there's a kind of closing tradition I have on this podcast, which is a final question, which I've asked the previous guest to write down a question for the next guest, not knowing who the guest is.
Oh no, okay.
And then obviously after this, you can write one down for the guest after this. So this is actually quite a good one, I think, for you, by chance. So what do people outside of the built environment think of the built environment industry?
I don't think they think very much about of it at all. In fact, I think that the built environment, the construction industry, I think we've lost our social license completely. I think when people see one of those little, planning notices on a lamppost, they think greedy developer, crooked contractor, Ponzi architect, that it's not going to do me or my community any good, and I think that's awful. Imagine the Romans. Imagine Romans, there's some kind of tablet, outside their door that says they're going to build a new temple. Those Romans are going, oh my goodness, that's amazing. God, we're such a fantastic society. Wow, I can't wait to see that building. I bet it's going to be gorgeous. And it just, I think that loss of social license, and specific to architecture, I think there is a loss of social license which happened, after the buildings of the 60s and 70s and the planning decisions of the 60s and 70s. And I think that actually, a low carbon construction, a natural, healthy types of buildings, I think this construction revolution, this change in the way in which we think about success in architecture, I think can actually renew our social license, and I think can actually give us a sense of purpose within society that as a profession specifically, but as an industry generally, we've really lost.
Yeah, and back to your point about 40% of emissions, coming from the built environment, it's got to come under much sharper focus.
Oh, we're really not doing very much about it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And then you mentioned, the idea about, trust and kind of a total disconnect with local people, and I think that's something that really needs to be, built up, and it's a very difficult thing to do because, you mentioned the 60s and almost Rome and other places. There's it's kind of an overused term, but this idea of kind of top down versus bottom up in terms of how we approach some of these things and trying to, as you say, engage with local communities, build some of that trust. And then I actually think as well a fundamental thing about what we design and make as an industry, being useful to people and fitting their
having
needs.
social value.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and not being about kind of self-expression. Yeah. Another shiny box.
Yes. Yeah.
It's just.
Yeah.
That's why we've lost it. It's because we're not building for our communities. We're not building for society. We're building for our own vanity and building for our own markets or our own, or worst of all, building for our own profession.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Andrew, it's a pleasure as always. So insightful, and
Thanks,
all the work you're doing is amazing. Both in terms of what you're building, but also I would say to everyone out there, particularly what you're saying and the influence you're having in some of those conversations. So thanks for that.
Great. Thanks a lot, Tom.
Thanks, Andrew.
That's
good one.
So nice of you. Thank you.
No, but it's true though. It's true.
Thank you for listening to the People Grow Places podcast. For more information, visit growplaces.com and follow us at We Grow Places across all social channels. See you next time.